Okay. Just accent.
Yeah. No, it's good information to have. All right, so Plotinus, given that we have just a short period of time, I want to try and fit this in 40 minutes, and then we'll supplement with discussion on Blackboard. So I want to focus on just the second and third tractate of the second Aeneid. The videos, that second video I sent you covers the readings that we had in the first Aeneid, which are primarily about the relation of body to soul, and the question of beauty. And what we have in the second Aeneid here, the second and third tractate of the second Aeneid, is a discussion about fate, providence, and free will. Primarily, the first or the second tractate, the first in our edition. As you probably noticed, there are some edits. Some of the tractates have been edited out. But the first tractate that we read is primarily about providence. Right? And providence is a question that is primarily associated, again, with Christian theology. And we know that Plotinus is setting up a lot of the groundwork for Christian theology through Neoplatonism, through this new interpretation of Plato in 3rd century Rome. And I think that Plotinus's interpretation of providence is one of the more interesting bridges that he makes between Platonism and what will become Christian theology. So what is providence, right? Well, providence, the word, our English word, is a good sort of approximation of the idea, which is that which is provided. Right? What has been provided for us, and what are we provided with in ourselves? That is, in essence, what is natural. Okay, what is natural? And we see Plotinus is thinking about providence in particular in relation to necessity. Part of what is at stake, or really the entirety of what's at stake in the second Aeneid, is the question of the relation between freedom and necessity. And this is a kind of departure, again, from classical Athenian philosophy, both Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle are less worried about the problem of necessity and less worried about the problem of freedom. For the Greek philosophers, it is assumed that human beings have freedom and that there is free will. When Platonic philosophy, Greek philosophy, is translated into Latin and is taken up by the Romans, a lot of the concerns about eternity and the unchanging nature of the forms and the eternals becomes translated into this worry about necessity, that which happens by necessity. And the general problem that Plotinus is formulating here is one that we're going to think about for the rest of the semester. It's one that we've already touched on. It's the problem of if nature is governed by unchanging forms, then everything that happens in nature and everything that is natural is necessary and fixed, determined. Nature is wholly determined. Right, so we've discussed this in terms of the laws of physics, right? If the laws of physics begin with the Big Bang, and are unchanging from the Big Bang until our time, then everything that has happened, everything that's come into being, everything that exists is existent. Sorry, I'm getting messages. Sorry. Existent by virtue of these necessary laws. And if everything that comes into existence according to necessary laws, then everything that happens is in some sense predetermined, right? There is no freedom. So what Plotinus is thinking about is this problem of necessity in terms of providence, where providence would be analogous to those laws of physics. Now, that's a very contemporary analogy. As we know, for Plotinus, matter is non-being. Matter does not have reality. Physicality is a kind of corruption of being, and therefore providence is not going to be manifested in physical reality itself. Providence is going to be something that exists primarily in the intellectual realm as an effect of the intellectual principle. But we can think about this example of the Big Bang and the laws of physics as an analogy for what Plotinus means by the providence of the intellectual realm. So I'm just seeing here also that you can use the chat function, right? There at the bottom of your screen, there's this chat bubble. If you want to, you're able to ask a question or a comment or whatever you want in this chat. I'll try to monitor that so nothing crazy happens. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mute you all now. And if you have questions, you can ask them in that chat bubble. So providence is the necessity of nature. It is what is provided by the intellectual principle. And the question, the problem with necessity is twofold. On the one hand, if everything happens according to fixed natural laws and follows necessarily from God's essence, the essence of the one or the intellectual principle, then where does evil come from, right? We've mentioned this before also. This is the quintessential problem of evil. If everything comes from God and everything that comes from God is good, how do we explain the existence of evil? That's the first problem that comes from the idea of a fixed natural law. The second problem that comes out of this scenario is the problem of freedom. If everything happens in a predetermined way, according to natural law, then how can human beings ever exert agency? If we are ourselves, if we want to use the physicalistic model, the contemporary model, which is not Plotinus's model, we'd say we are wholly physical beings. Everything that happens in our brains is a result of physical, chemical processes, and every action that we take in the physical world is caused by physical forces. Therefore, we are, as physical beings, fundamentally no different than a rock or a stone or certainly an animal. Everything we do is dictated by necessity, by natural necessity, natural law. If we take the more intellectual, sort of theological model of Plotinus, we'd say everything that we are either comes from our higher creator, the intellectual principle. Thus, all of our ideas are not properly speaking, our own, but are our our gaining access to this higher realm, which belongs to the intellectual principle itself. Therefore, we can't take responsibility for those ideas, for that thinking, and any action that is caused by the ideas that we get from the intellectual principle would properly be attributed to that higher realm and not to us, right? So we, again, lose responsibility for our agency, for our ideas and our action. And we wouldn't be responsible for our bad actions either, which would be the consequence simply of our unfortunate embodiment within matter. So in a purely deterministic model in which everything happens according to necessity, in which everything is providence, we can't explain very well why there's evil, and we can't find where human freedom might exist. So we know that Plotinus's whole philosophical project is about trying to reconcile the idea of a pure, unchanging, and eternal soul with the body and the changing, corrupting physical world. And as I tried to explain in the last lecture that I sent by video, his answer is that there are, in essence, sort of two forms of soul that we have. When we speak of the we are referring to the individual as a couplement of body and soul, a couplement that is universal among humans. And that couplement it is made up of body and soul. And the soul part of that couplement has access to this higher, purified, detached soul. That higher soul illuminates, gives the principle of the couplement of body and soul through what Plotinus calls emanation or radiation. So we're going to think a little bit more about that today, and that model, that dynamic of the emanating soul, the radiating soul, is going to be the way that Plotinus tries to work out this problem of freedom. Can I repeat the problem of freedom again? Yeah, certainly. Good question, thank you. And that's, I love that. By all means, please ask questions in the comments. I've never done an Instagram live video before. I feel like, you know, a minor celebrity. So the problem of freedom is that if we say everything is determined according to necessary laws, if everything that exists is provided by an unchanging form, then there's no room for those laws to be changed or interrupted by any other agent like ourselves, right? If we think about the law of gravity, and again, I forgive me for being overly physicalistic in here. I just think it's easier to understand this way. Think about the law of gravity, right? The law of gravity is necessary. The law of gravity is an example of providence. It is what is provided universally in reality. For now, ignore the fact that gravity changes depending on your planet, but there is a universal physical principle of gravity. That principle of gravity can never be evaded, can never be avoided or interrupted through human freedom. We are unable to change the law of gravity. We can work around it with airplanes, but that is simply using other necessary laws. And if we just think about it very simply, the law can never be broken. Right? Human law can be broken, natural law cannot be broken. So if everything that exists is existing by virtue of natural law, right? If everything that happens with the same necessity that objects fall to the earth at 9.8 meters per second squared, then there is nothing in the world that can be changed through human agency alone. Does that make sense? More sense? All right, we can pick this up again in the Blackboard discussion. This is a very, I think, great topic to try and hash out on Blackboard. So Plotinus's solution to this problem is going to be pretty difficult and complicated, but it's going to hinge on this idea of illumination. So let's walk through the texts. The text. I think this is a better format for doing a close textual reading. So if you can, I recommend getting your books and we can look at the pages together. So on the first page of the second tractate, on page 135, he begins to make the existence and coherent structure of this universe depend upon automatic activity and upon chance is against all good sense. So, to make the existence and coherent structure of this universe depend upon, one, automatic activity. Automatic activity means free will, right? Insofar as I am an autonomous agent when I act with free will, my action is automatic. I think that's what he means, right? Autonomy is self-rule. Auto, nomi being nomos being the Greek word for law, right? Auto being self, it means self-ruled, self-governed. So if everything in the universe were self-governed, then that wouldn't make sense. Second, the universe can't depend on chance alone. And so there is a worldview in which people think everything is freedom and chance. Everything is about the intentions of individual actors or chance. And Plotinus is saying the universe can't be structured like this. In other words, there is a more all-encompassing necessity. There is a structure to everything that happens. This is a continuation of his theory of beauty, right? That beauty is finding patterns. Beauty is about form manifesting itself in the physical realm. He's saying, in the same way that we can find a landscape beautiful or an object beautiful, that what that points to is that there is an inherent structure, an inherent kind of necessity that governs all things. Yes, we're in the Enneads. We're looking at the second Ennead. We're on page 135 here. Right, so he's trying to figure out what the structure, how we can make the case that there is this all-encompassing structure. So what Plotinus is driving at is, again, this idea that everything that is, all of existence, is part of what he calls the one. And we know that one He's using the word intellectual principle at this stage to name that one. The one is God, is the highest being in the hierarchy of being. So we're looking for more evidence that everything is governed by this oneness. So he says, on the one hand, people say that, this is on the very top of 136, we have the denial of any controlling power. All existence is total randomness and individual agents pursuing their own self-interest, creating chaos. On the other hand, we have the belief that the cosmos is the work of an evil creator. So this is important context for Plotinus. This second doctrine, that the cosmos is the work of an evil creator, is the belief of the Gnostics. And the Gnostics were were one half of competing theologies of Christianity. In the very early church, the Christian doctrine was divided between two factions. One group of people, referred to as the Church Fathers, were in conflict with another group of people, the Gnostics. And Plotinus argues against the Gnostics in general. And though he isn't a Christian explicitly, his philosophy is much more in line with the Church Fathers. But it's interesting to think about the ways that Plotinus is very similar to the Gnostics. The Gnostics believed that God is entirely remote, which is to say, within the physical world, there are no signs of the true God. That the only divinity that is present and recognizable in the physical world is a fallen divinity, what were called the aeons. And these aeons were demigods. They were, in a sense, false gods. And so the job of the Gnostic believer is to overcome these demigods who are themselves corrupted by their participation in the physical realm, and transcend to this remote and unknowable, unrecognizable Godhead beyond any physical mark. And that's not precisely what Plotinus says, but it's similar to the idea of emanation that he gives. That in fact, there is nothing that has the mark of divinity in itself in being. The only way in which divinity presents itself in the physical realm is through knowability of any kind. There is no sort of knowledge of the divine, but knowability itself is the only evidence of divinity. For the Gnostics, knowledge is intuition. You can only have intuitive knowledge about this remote Godhead, that is, divinely inspired knowledge. So Plotinus doesn't exactly think that, but this idea of the remote Godhead that is evident solely through illumination and emanation is closer to the Gnostics than perhaps he would like to be. Anyway, sorry, that's kind of an aside. So the problem with providence, then, is, right, as we've just seen, these are the two problems that we saw. Either there's no controlling power and everything that's created is evil. I suppose the Gnostic problem is the kind of flip side of the problem of evil. How can there be evil? Well, maybe the answer is everything in the physical world is evil, and good is in an entirely different realm. So, Plotinus says, God provides for the production of the universe and secures all possible perfection in it. Uh, so let's extrapolate from this a little bit and read this whole quote. Of course, the belief that after a certain lapse of time, a cosmos previously non-existent came into being would imply a foreseeing and a reasoned plan on the part of God, providing for the production of the universe and securing all possible perfection in it. This is setting up Plotinus's essential thesis, which is that God, in creating the universe, had to engage in the act of creation. That is to say, creation itself involves coming into being, involves change, right? We've said this before, that the very first change in existence, is the change from non-being to being. So by effecting, oh, look at that, Zoom removed the 40-minute time limit. Thanks, Zoom. All right. So by effecting this initial change from non-being to being, God has already had to compromise perfection, right? By making form into matter with the initial infusing of matter with form, form has already necessarily been compromised. And so in the physical world, God is not able to make all things perfect. The addition of matter makes it impossible for God to make the physical world perfect. So the best that God can do is secure all possible perfection. So we're going to see a similar philosophy of physicality and of God when we look at Leibniz in a few weeks. And I'm going to use Leibniz's phrase to explain a little bit maybe what Plotinus means here. So for Leibniz, this scenario is one in which God creates the best of all possible worlds. This is a very interesting thought, right? Because what it implies is that even God is restrained by certain laws of necessity. That even for God, not all things are possible. That the combination of form and matter is in itself going to result in imperfections, even when God does it. So for Leibniz, there are many possible worlds, and all of them include some degree of evil, some degree of suffering and pain and malaction. The degree of evil that exists in our world, the world that actually exists, is the smallest amount of evil that could be secured within all possible worlds. So Plotinus is edging toward this conclusion also, right? That God made the best world he could, but that the combination of matter and form will inevitably lead to evil and suffering. Uh, Now, what this points to is something that we've already covered, that Plotinus spent a lot of time uh, detailing in the first Aeneid, but he goes over it a little bit more here, which is that what this means is that God is reason itself, right? Is the intellectual principle. Uh, so let's look at 137 here. It says, well, okay, let's walk through 137. Or let's start on 136. I'm sorry. We'll go back to the bottom paragraph. The authentic and primal cosmos is the being of the intellectual principle and of the veritable existence. This contains within itself no spatial distinction, has none of the feebleness of division. So, authentic and primal cosmos is the intellectual principle. And again, I want to just point out that there are Gnostic overtones here, right? Um, Plotinus is setting up two different cosmoses, two different aspects of the cosmos, at least. The authentic and primal cosmos, which gives things their veritable existence. And then we're going to have a lower cosmos, the cosmos which is corrupted and compromised by matter. Uh, Again, this duality, which is Platonic in its character. He goes on, this authentic and primal cosmos contains within itself no spatial distinction, none of the feebleness of division. This authentic cosmos is a one, is entirely unified. The reason why matter is corrupting and matter is right, less real than this authentic cosmos is because matter imposes division. Matter imposes individuation and particularity. And that individuation is what breaks up the authenticity and the purity of this primal cosmos. Again, this is a kind of elegant negotiation of Plato and Aristotle. Right? Aristotle says particularity is what defines the physical realm, and its particularity that we need to account for in the physical realm. And Plato is saying, right, but truth is one and singular. So, how do we negotiate these? With this idea of emanation, right? I think that image again that we saw in I think it was the second tractate in the first Aeneid, of one face that is reflected in many different mirrors. I'll get to your question in 1 second. One face that's reflected in many different mirrors. This authentic primal cosmos is a unified, singular face. And matter is a mirror, right? Matter is an infinite number of mirrors, divided mirrors, singular mirrors, that are all reflecting the same face. So we can see why Plotinus would say then that the physical manifestation of the face is less than the face itself, because it only shows one aspect, one side. But though it is less than and incomplete, it is nevertheless an image of the one face. So to repeat the idea about individuality and the authentic and primal cosmos, hopefully that image of the one face reflected in many mirrors illustrates that a little bit, but the idea is, right, this oneness of authentic and primal cosmos uh, becomes becomes weakened and corrupted as it is individuated in all of these individual mirrors, as it's divided among individual things in the physical realm. That's a great question. Thanks for flagging it. I will say more about all the questions you raise in the comments on Blackboard. So, one of the problems with this is, right, not only is the body individuated, right, we have individual bodies, but we also have individual reason. Every person has their own share of reason. So Plotinus asks, why should reason elaborate yet another reason, or intelligence another intelligence? Why would reason break itself up into all these individual minds when, right, it is unified and one and authentic in itself? Why have a material realm at all? Like, the indwelling power of making things is in the character of a being not at all points as it should be, but making moving by reason of some failure in quality. Those whose nature is all blessedness have no more to do than to repose in themselves and be their being. Okay, right? Why make all these things? Why is reason the intellectual principle, not simply lying back and enjoying being the all-powerful, authentic one? Why bother with this physical realm at all? It's a very interesting question. Recalls us to Schopenhauer's question. Why is there something rather than nothing? If God could only make an imperfect world, why bother? A widespread activity is dangerous to those who must go out from themselves to act. Okay. A widespread activity is dangerous to those who must go out from themselves to act. Action is dangerous for those who must enter into the physical world in order to act. But such is the blessedness of this being that in its very non-action, it magnificently operates, and in its self-dwelling, it produces mightily. Thank you. This is 137. I was just going to mention that. This is page 137, the end of section 1. So, why does reason divide itself into individuality? Why does God produce this physical realm? It is the nature of its being. The world issues from its being not by an act of will, but by the very nature of what God is, by the very nature of this intellectual principle itself. The intellectual principle doesn't decide to go out and create these individual worlds. These individual worlds emanate from the intellectual principle without any action or intention or decision on the part of that intellectual principle. And in its very non-action, it magnificently operates. In its self-dwelling, it produces mightily. By resting, it produces this changing world. Resting, it moves. Resting, it changes. The Heraclitean quotation is changing, it rests. But this is an inversion of that, right? Resting, it changes. And in its self-dwelling, it produces. By just being itself, it creates this world. So we, human beings, when we act, have to go out and act on something. Right? Because there is nothing outside of the intellectual principle, God. There is nothing for God to act on. So God doesn't, in our common sense understanding of it, act. God's action is merely being. And in being, the physical world results as a consequence, right? But not in the causal way that we think of it. Okay. Continuing on page 137. By derivation from that authentic cosmos, one within, there subsists this lower cosmos, no longer a true unity. So this world that emanates from out of this unmoving, unchanging, self-dwelling God, there comes this lower cosmos, which is no longer a true unity. Like, think of this, I think, as a kind of natural deterioration of an act, that we are on the sort of periphery of the existence of God. And at the peripheries, things are less clear, less unified than at the center, but they nonetheless belong to that same center. So he goes on, this cosmos of parts has come into being not as the result of a judgment establishing its desirability, but by the sheer necessity of a secondary kind. Right? The necessity of there being a secondary effect of God's existence. That is the nature of the cosmos, this lower cosmos. So the intellectual realm was not of a nature to be the ultimate of existence. It was the first, and it held great power, all there is of power. This means that it is productive without seeking to produce. So again, there is no act of production. Mind produces the physical world by accident, as it were. Now, when it comes to how this influences us and our actions, we, in the physical world, we recall, have this connection to the intellectual principle through reason, through our own share of the intellectual principle. Where is necessity and freedom for us? What is the nature of necessity in this picture? We've seen already, or I've mentioned, that God, without choosing, secures the best possible world. Right? So I want to clarify something I said earlier, that connection to Leibniz, right? The philosopher says, this is the best of all possible worlds. We shouldn't say that God chooses the best of all possible worlds, but instead that the nature of God is to produce a physical world that is the best that a physical world could possibly be. Now, the physical manifestation of God is God constrained by necessity, right? Necessity is that which constrains us as physical beings from becoming like God. The impact of necessity on us as human beings lies in our having a body, lies in our being physical and in the material world. Necessity is that which constrains us and us as God. Necessity is that, again, which constrains even God. This is where it gets confusing, right? And let's bring back that language that we saw in Aristotle, right? That word qua, which just means as. It's philosophical jargon, but it is useful for talking about this, specifically this kind of idea. So God qua God, God in himself, the intellectual principle in itself, is not constrained by necessity. Right? God qua God is unchanging and perfect. Necessity is that which limits something. That which is perfect doesn't have a limit, so to speak, because it wouldn't ever desire or lack something that would lie beyond a limit. So God qua God is not constrained by necessity. God qua human being is constrained by necessity. Right? Just as the reflection of the face in a mirror is constrained by the angle of the mirror, only shows one perspective. When the intellectual principle becomes manifest in physicality, it becomes constrained by necessity. So again, we could put it this way: human being, qua God, as a participant in the one, is unconstrained by necessity. Right? Human being as a soul that is caused by and connected to the pure soul is unconstrained by necessity and therefore free. The human being qua human being as embodied couplement of soul and body is constrained by necessity and is limited. So on page 138, he says, amid all that they affect and accept, the divine realm imposes the one harmonious act. Each utters its own voice, but all is brought into accord, into an ordered system for the universal purpose by the ruling reason principle. This universe is not intelligence or reason like the supernatural, but participant in intelligence and reason. It stands in need of the harmonizing because it is the meeting ground of necessity and divine reason. Necessity pulling toward the lower, toward the unreason, which is its own characteristic, while yet the intellectual principle remains sovereign over it. And so necessity is that which pulls this lower cosmos away from the divine cosmos. And so he goes on in section 3 on page 138, the world, we must reflect, is a product of necessity, not of deliberate purpose. It is due to a higher kind engendering in its own likeness by a natural process. Okay, so the world itself is a product of necessity. What Plotinus means by the world is the physical world. And this is an interesting distinction, right? We distinguish between the world and being. Right? The world refers to the physical realm, the realm of human action, the realm of necessity. Being is something that is higher. Being is the cause of the world. But what separates the world from being is this corrupting aspect of necessity that is the mark of the world. All right, so what we have in the world then is a sort of manifold, which is to say, unknowable. Well, no, sorry. Unknowable is not the right word. A confusing mix of necessity and freedom, where freedom is what makes necessity possible in the first place. In order for the law of gravity to come into existence, there must be, prior to that coming into existence, the freedom for the principle of gravity to come into existence. So we have a question: how is God qua human being constrained? God qua human being is constrained because the human being is a kind of after effect of the existence of God, and the effect is less pure and less powerful than the cause. The effect is derivative of the cause, and in that derivation, in that separation from the cause, the effect loses its efficacy, its power, and its purity. So the cause is responsible for the effect, but the effect is differentiated from the cause, and that differentiation is the corrosion of purity. Also a great question. Please, I encourage you to enter these questions in the Blackboard, and I'll do my best to explain them more. Sorry I missed that earlier. Now, freedom precedes necessity. And this is, I think, speaks to that question also. There must be the freedom for the necessity of gravity to exist in order for necessity to come into existence. Freedom always precedes necessity. So freedom is what governs the whole world. The world can't come into existence without freedom. Therefore, freedom touches everything that exists. And yet, freedom gives rise to its opposite, to necessity. And in the world, therefore, we always have a kind of double nature to all things, sense in which it's free as qua God, and a sense in which it is constrained qua physical thing constrained by laws of necessity. Now, how does that freedom manifest itself within this necessity? How are we supposed to understand the godliness of all the suffering and pain and conflict of the physical world? Plotinus here is going to, this is where I think Plotinus gets into this diciest territory, where he really kind of wants to say two things. He wants to say, he wants to make a sort of strictly determinist argument, saying that everything that exists is good because it issues from God, right? The world qua good, the world qua God is inherently good. And yet he also wants to say that we as human beings are able to see the world both qua world and qua God. And we as human beings are able to break out of that necessity. Now, let me try and break out of that necessity and make the world better, make ourselves better within the world. He doesn't seem to think that human beings can improve the world, but that we can improve ourselves. The world is good because it comes from God, but we have a God-given freedom that allows us to see improvability within ourselves, even though we are worldly. So the sort of conflict here is Plotinus wants, on the one hand, to say, even the suffering and pain that we experience in the world is good because a necessary consequence of God's existence. On the other hand, he wants to say that pain and suffering of the physical world is bad, and we human beings have the ability to transcend it and do better. Write down your questions. This is extremely confusing and complicated material. I mean, honestly, there is no philosopher that has a good grasp of the relation between freedom and necessity. Plotinus is doing his best. So on page 140, he says, the conflict and destruction that reign among living beings are inevitable, since things here are derived, brought into existence because the divine reason which contains all of them in the upper heavens, how could they come here unless they were there, must outflow over the whole extent of matter. Okay, right, so conflict and destruction are inevitable and therefore good because they're brought into existence because of divine reason. And he goes on, similarly, the very wronging of man by man may be derived from an effort toward the good, foiled in their weakness of their true desires, they turn against each other. Still, when they do wrong, they pay the penalty, that of having hurt their souls by their evil conduct and of the degradation to a lower place. So the human being, right, as part of this physical world, is foiled by our weakness, our inevitable embodiment, right? What in Christian theology will become understood as the fall, right? That's sort of, I guess, a Gnostic idea, right? What is the fall? The fall is the fall into physicality. So this weakness makes us predisposed to conflict. We are thrown into conflict and turmoil, and this is the state of the world. There's no escaping that. That's inevitable, right? We are predestined to do wrong. And this is what Plotinus is talking about also in the second tractate of the second Ennead, where he's saying, or maybe it's the end of the first tractate, where he's talking about drama, right? He says, look, war, conflict, death, suffering, pain, all these things, right? And even intellectual debate, uncertainty about truth, confusion, all of these things are evil, but that evil is necessary. And we should accept it as an inevitable part of the world, right? What is the unity of the world? It is the drama of suffering, the drama of conflict, of clash between ideas, between people, war, the clash between necessity and freedom, right? The world is a part of the one. The world is unified, but that unity manifests as drama and conflict. Let me see if I can find that section quickly. Um, sorry. Uh, on 152, he states, but this reason principle which emanates from the complete unity, divine mind, and the complete unity, life, which is soul, is neither a uniate complete life nor a uniate complete divine mind, nor does it give itself whole and all including to its subject being the world. By an imperfect communication, it sets up a conflict of part against part. It produces imperfect things and so engenders and maintains war and attack. And thus its unity can be that only of a sum total, not of a thing undivided. Right? We remember this distinction between the one of Parmenides and the all of Heraclitus. Right? There is the singular undivided one, and then there is the sum total of the all. And what what Plotinus is saying is that undivided, unified one is this detached soul. That oneness is still a one in the realm of division and physicality, but that oneness is translated as an allness in that realm of division. And that allness is nevertheless an all, nevertheless unified, if the parts, if members of that all are at war with one another, are in conflict with one another. It says, at war with itself, continuing on 152. In the parts which it now exhibits, it has the unity or harmony of a drama torn with struggle. The drama, of course, brings the conflicting elements to one final harmony, weaving the entire story of the clashing characters into one thing. And here comes Heraclitus. While in the logos, the conflict of the divergent elements rises within the one element, the reason principle. The comparison, therefore, is rather with a harmony emerging directly from the conflicting elements themselves, and the question becomes what introduces clashing elements among these reason principles. Right? So let's just hear this extremely Heraclitean idea, right? In the logos, the conflict of the divergent elements rises within the one element, the reason principle, right? The divergent is convergent, is Heraclitus. This is precisely what Plotinus is saying. The allness is a drama. The world is inevitably a drama. But just like a drama, which is conflict and tragedy and fragmentation and separation and suffering, drama is one, is a unified thing, and the same is true of the world. Okay, so going back to 140. Although all this is inevitable, although we can't escape the fact that we live in a drama and that there is pain and suffering, conflict, nevertheless, human beings are called upon to take responsibility for their actions. Still, he says on 140, when they do wrong, they pay the penalty. Human beings are unique in the world because they alone are also responsible for trying to be good and responsible for taking, for being accountable for the evil that they are saddled with as embodied beings. So as we discussed in the section on evil, and for the next couple of pages, Plotinus is the next 2 pages, he's on about evil again. Evil is just the absence of good. This absence is the presence of matter. Matter becoming embodied is a detraction from the purity of the soul. Can I repeat what I said about oneness and allness? I think, again, I'm going to return to this image of the one face reflected in many mirrors. Right, those many mirrors, all of them represent the same thing, right? They are the all. The face is a unified one. That oneness doesn't lose any of its oneness when it's reflected in many mirrors. But no single mirror will reflect that oneness. And one mirror will reflect an image that is in conflict with an image in a different mirror. One mirror shows an ear, another mirror shows a chin. And so those 2 mirrors will have very different ideas about what that oneness is. They'll be in conflict with one another. That conflict is inevitable. Yet, when taken as a whole, all of these mirrors will represent that same oneness, that same singularity. Thank you for that question. Again, let's, by all means, continue that in Blackboard. All right. So the human being must take responsibility for itself and for its share of evil, even though it is not responsible for that evil, right? This is the drama and tragedy of being human. It's not our fault that we aren't perfect, right? We are evil, we suffer through no fault of our own, simply because we are physical things, because we are embodied. For all other beings within the world, that's just the way it goes, right? But for humans, we uniquely are asked to take responsibility for that evil, even though it's not strictly our responsibility. Right? We don't cause the evil. Evil is the result of matter itself. But because we have a share of the intellectual principle, because we have reason, we're able to differentiate between the pure goodness of soul and form, of pure being, and the evil of matter. And because we're able to make that distinction, we have a responsibility to improve ourselves, to purify ourselves through the denial of matter and the movement toward the intellectual principle. So this is the plight of being human, right? We have to take responsibility for an evil that we participate in, even though we aren't the cause of that evil. So let's then look at page 146, where he makes this point at the bottom. It says, if there is a necessity bringing about human wickedness, either by force of the celestial movement or by a rigorous sequence set up by the first cause, is not the evil a thing rooted in nature? Right? And if thus the reason principle of the universe is the creator of evil, surely all is injustice. And Plotinus' answer, no, men are no doubt involuntary sinners in the sense that they do not actually desire to sin, right? We are set up to sin in some sense. And, sin is an interesting word. Here it's related to evil and matter and desires of the body. But it's interesting to think about sin as a consequence of being embodied, a consequence of matter in itself, right? And this sort of Gnostic idea that Plotinus is getting at a little bit, and we'll see this, but not in this class, but this comes back in 19th century philosophy and Soren Kierkegaard also, the idea that sin is a condition, not a choice. That even going back to original sin, the sin is an inherent condition that is not about a particular mistake or choice. Anyway, so do not desire to sin, but this does not alter the fact that wrongdoers or their own choice are themselves the agents. It is because they themselves act that the sin is their own. If they were not agents, they could not sin. And so we, because we have reason, act. What Plotinus is getting at here is this idea that there's a difference between human action and all other kinds of action in the physical world. We'd say that inanimate objects only have motion. They are moved entirely passively, and that non-rational animals only have instinctual reaction, right? They react to their environment. Only human beings are capable of response, which is a action based on reflection. Because we have this unique capacity, our action has the capacity to transcend the physical world. And because we have this capacity, we are asked to be responsible for our physicality, even though it is not of our making. All right. good. So we got to this section on 152. Now, I want to just look at one passage on 155, and then I think we've covered most of what I wanted to cover for today. I guess we'll look at a little bit in the next tractate. The world that Plotinus imagines, in which we all take responsibility, in which, in the drama of life, we all do our best to transcend our physical circumstances, is one in which we all become, to the greatest extent possible, our own principles. So let's, go back to 147, the very end of section 10. It says, but as things are, efficient act does come from men. Remember, efficient act is the immediate cause in Aristotle's list of causes. Given the starting principle, the secondary line, no doubt, is inevitably completed, but each and every principle contributes toward the sequence. Right? So we become principles within the world. Now men are principles, or at least they are moved by their characteristic nature toward all that is good, and that nature is a principle, a freely acting cause. Insofar as we are able to take responsibility for ourselves, that act of taking responsibility is an act of becoming godlike, becoming a principle in ourselves, a principle that is a self-cause. Remember, Plotinus says the world is not made up of autonomous actors. When we act responsibly, when we act with free will, the topic of this section is action and sin. That's accurate. When we act responsibly, we are not acting out of line with God. When we're acting responsibly, we're acting as a principle and a self-cause. As such, we are acting in unison with the ultimate principle and the first cause, which is self-caused. By becoming self-caused ourselves, we bind ourselves to the first cause. Now, what this is setting up is the idea that human freedom is identical to God's freedom. That in order to be free, we have to use our reason, engage in our intellectual principle, to separate ourselves from the evil and necessity of the physical world. By exercising that intellectual principle, we are not individuating ourselves. In fact, we are unifying ourselves with this higher principle, with God, the intellectual principle itself. So the only choice that we have is between good and evil, between the intellectual and the physical. When we choose the physical, we are not acting on our own. We are part of the series of causes in the physical world. When I choose to eat food, I'm not acting as myself, I'm acting as a body that is hungry, that needs to eat out of necessity. When I choose to go to sleep, same thing, right? Any physical act is dictated by necessity, by the physicality of the world. But similarly, when I act according to reason and the intellectual principle, I'm also not acting of my own accord. I am not creating these concepts as an individual. I'm not thinking as an individual. When I'm thinking the truth and when I am contemplating eternal things, when I turn to the soul rather than to the world, I am participating in the thinking that belongs to God, not to me. So my choice is to participate in God or participate in the physical world. Qua God, qua physical thing, I have no freedom. My only freedom is to decide which of those things I'm going to be ruled by. So we read on page 159, if man were all of one piece, I mean, if he were nothing more than a made thing, acted and acted upon according to a fixed nature, he could be no more subject to reproach and punishment than the mere animals. But as the scheme holds, man is singled out for condemnation when he does evil, and this with justice. For he is no mere thing made to a rigid plan. His nature contains a principle apart and free. We alone are singled out for condemnation. We alone have the capacity to be ethical. We alone have the choice to participate in the necessity of the physical world or the freedom of God. Now, interestingly, Plotinus doesn't think that if we all choose the freedom of God, if we all choose the greatest perfection possible, that conflict would end. Because on the one hand, we're physical things. By being physical, we are unavoidably part of a drama and a conflict. But even if we were all to exercise our freedom to the greatest extent possible, because reason is different in each one of us, we each have a different image of divine reason within us, there is still going to be intellectual disagreement and debate within the world. There is just no escaping differentiation, division, and thus conflict. Even a bunch of fasting monks who have disavowed the body to the greatest extent possible are going to have intellectual disagreements. That is the nature of being human. And this is a nice way to think about Platonic dialogue and think about why Plato writes dialogues and think about what philosophy is supposed to be. It's not that we arrive at the right answer and that we can be done with philosophy at some point. We will always have to be engaged in debate, always be having these kinds of conflicts because of our condition. That's the human condition. So philosophy is always dialectic, always going to be discourse, back and forth. And the highest human freedom is to be engaged in this discourse, this dialectic. The closest we can come to being godlike, to being pure, is to engage in this kind of philosophical debate and philosophical contemplation. All right, so I think we'll cut it there today. That's time. We're actually over time, in fact. Sorry about that, by 5 minutes. So thanks for bearing with me. Let's move discussion to Blackboard. And there's a section, or I'm not sure I made a section, but in any case, I'll start a thread in the discussion about if we prefer the video or the lecture. I see almost no difference, although I like that you're able to ask questions here. Yeah, go ahead, question. Yeah, let's say you're free to go, but if you want to stick around and ask questions in the chat, I'll answer anything for another 5 or 10 minutes or so. So I'll start a discussion on Blackboard, but if you want to stick around, you can ask questions and we'll discuss. All right, thanks everyone. Yes, I have recorded this and I'm going to upload it. It takes so long to upload to Blackboard. So I think Dropbox is just easier and more reliable. So that's what I'm going to keep using if that works for people. Can we begin next class at 12:15? Yeah, definitely. I could only make a Blackboard meeting for noon. They don't do increments of 15 minutes, so that's why I did, but that's silly. Of course, you guys have classes before that. So, okay, yeah, next class we'll do 12:15. Yes, I'm going to email you about the papers, and I'll set up a Blackboard discussion about that also. Will the midterm topics be posted on Blackboard? Yeah, we don't have an official midterm. I think we just have a paper. Your first 2 papers were going to constitute your midterm grade. It's going to be based on just the 1 paper, but as I said, I'm going to give you guys a bump because you haven't had a chance to improve on that grade, and you haven't even been able to get comments on it because you don't have your physical papers. So we'll do, I'll try and give you all a little bump, and we'll have papers due on the 23rd. Do we have anything due on Monday? No, I think we have 1 more reading in Plotinus, and then we're moving on. So we're just doing reading and response. When our discussion posts due, there are no assignments for discussion as of yet. I think that might be a good idea. I strongly encourage you all to ask questions. You'll probably get more, we can have more extended conversations on Blackboard, certainly. But nothing is required. I have sent out grades for the papers. If you didn't get an email with your grade, email me and I'll send it to you. It's really a shame. I mean, I spent a lot of time writing comments on all of your papers, so it's too bad that I wasn't able to get those back to you, and I'm really sorry that you don't get to see comments on your papers. That's really not fair. The next paper will be like the last paper. The question is, how many questions will there be for the next paper, the midterm paper? I'll probably write 3 questions. You'll have a choice between 3 questions. I have not sent them out yet. I'm going to write them now. I want to get a sense of if this format is working. I don't want to write a paper question on Plotinus and have it feel like, because you haven't been able to ask questions face to face and we haven't done it in our usual way, it's all much more confusing. Can I scan your papers? If you really want your paper questioned, I can take a I can figure out a way. I don't have a working scanner, but my printer is very old and broken, but I can take photos and send them to you. I cannot scan however many papers I have, 90 papers. It's not going to happen. But if you feel strongly, I'll send photos of my comments. No change in the syllabus. We are up to date on the syllabus. The videos I sent covered the material for Monday. This is what we were supposed to read for today, and we're keeping with the schedule for next Monday also. If that changes, I'll send an email. All right, any other questions? All right, sounds good. So, oh, no. Okay, so for Monday, yes, we'll start at 12:15. Sorry about that for those of you who had classes earlier. That was silly. And we're sticking with the syllabus. I'll send paper questions today and or tonight, tomorrow at the latest. I want to get a little bit of feedback on what makes sense. And then we will meet again by Zoom. I think this provides a little bit more interactivity than the videos, so that's I think better. All right, unless final questions, then we're all set. All right, thank you. Thanks everyone. Good luck. I hope you're you know, taking things seriously but not panicking. Everything is we're going to do the best we can. All right, have a good time. Have a safe time.